China continues to strengthen its hold on the South China Sea behind the nine-dash line. The United States and other nations are starting to confront the Asian powerhouse. Is conflict unavoidable? That's today's conversation taking place in Asia now. When looking down upon it from space, the South China Sea looks beautiful. The massive 3.5 million square kilometer area encompasses some of the most stunning coastlines and coral reefs on the planet. It also happens to be a powder keg of controversy. For the past year, there has been a steady buildup of activity on China's part inside its self-declared nine-dash line. There was even deployment of an oil rig inside Vietnam's established exclusive economic zone, of course, the bullying of weaker ASEAN members, and of course, the unprecedented land reclamation efforts that have quadrupled in recent months. We now may be entering a new phase as tensions in the region increase. China repeatedly calls the roughly 90% of the South China Sea unquestionably theirs and considers all landmasses within that boundary under Beijing's sovereign control. The United States has, of late, been showing more force in the area, strengthening ties with ASEAN members and forming a trilateral alliance between Japan and Australia to promote greater maritime security. China's President Xi Jinping told Secretary John Kerry on his recent visit that the two nations shouldn't be distracted by insignificant differences and that the Pacific Ocean was big enough for the two great nations. Joining me now via Skype is Jonathan Miller, fellow on East Asia for the EastWest Institute. Jonathan, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks a lot, Steve. Good to be here.
All right, so we're talking South China Sea, and of course, China. Beijing is digging in on those reclaimed reefs, forming those little islands there. They have some even with alleged anti-aircraft guns. The United States is strengthening its ties with its allies to try and stop China from expanding. I have to ask you, are we entering an area where we can say that we have manifested a new millennial Cold War in the region?
Well, thanks, Steve. As you correctly noted, that tensions are increasing quite a bit in the South China Sea. I'm not quite sure that at this point yet we're at the point to declare it at a Cold War level per se. But that being said, I think the U.S. has been signaling that it's to its allies in the region, especially the Philippines and even to Vietnam, which is not one of its treaty allies, that it needs to show some reassurance here to the Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea. As you mentioned, the land reclamation projects in the South China Sea have raised great concerns in Southeast Asia, and I believe that a lot of this kind of the release of the United States video via CNN of the surveillance flights, a lot of this is meant to as a signal to China that the United States is not going to just sit by and allow this to happen. I think as a little bit of context too, it's interesting to kind of link this a little bit to what's happening and what has happened in the East China Sea with Japan. It's not the situations are quite different, but I think it follows a greater trend of how the U.S. sees Chinese maritime assertiveness in Asia, and if you see even recently through Assistant Secretary of State Daniel Russell's testimony, where he basically tried to frame it that way, saying that this is more about the freedom of navigation, the rule of law. And I think that's more the angle that the United States is going on, rather than just all of a sudden doubling down specifically on the South China Sea.
Yeah, and I think that is, as you mentioned, the freedom of navigation, partnering with other countries in the region. We see them partnering with Japan and also the new trilateral alliance with Australia. But those, Japan, Australia, United States, big powers. But we're talking also about smaller, weaker ASEAN countries, Philippines, Brunei, Vietnam. Those are the ones that have a direct stake in the South China Sea. As the United States and Beijing tend to go back and forth on this matter. What does that mean for these smaller countries?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think that for at least for now, a lot of the countries, the two principal claimants who have been the most affected by Chinese actions in the South China Sea have been Vietnam and the Philippines. Philippines being a U.S. ally. So from Manila's perspective, I feel like it's very welcome right now, the U.S. being more actively engaged in the South China Sea and more actively showing that it's willing to reassure some of the other claimants. I believe that there's a sense that when the Scarborough Shoal incident happened in 2012 and the Philippines and China had quite a conflictual clash at that point. There was a sense that although the U.S. lent its support diplomatically, that basically Beijing was able to get its way. I think some in Washington feel like they wouldn't mind a redo of that now, and I think reassuring the Philippines and also Vietnam, which has significant maritime claims, is going to be key to Washington's strategy. So I think that both of those countries and the other claimants, which have not been as conflictual in their claims with China, will be watching out for that.
Now, you mentioned it already, the CNN video where they were on board that quote-unquote spy plane and they were being hailed by China to be told to leave the area. The United States has also come out and said they're thinking about possibly going even closer to some of the area that China says is theirs. Over the past weekend, Deputy Secretary of State Anthony Blinken said that we could enter an area or a point where skirmishes could occur. Do you think that is likely, given how adamantly China is saying that all the area outlined by the 9-dash line is inherently theirs?
Well, I think it is possible. I mean, there was, I believe it was in 2012, the incident with the USS the Cowpens ship. It actually might have been a bit later, but that was an incident that was where the USS Cowpens had to make a very quick diversion in order not to be hit by a Chinese ship. So I think that these type of miscalculations, when you're putting assets in the area, there's always a chance of that. I feel like that was one of the concerns with China declaring the air defense identification zone in the East China Sea a while back, and the U.S. Quickly responded to that by sending its airplanes directly over that zone and not without consideration of Beijing's unilateral declaration. So I think there is still a chance for these miscalculations in the South China Sea, and something to really watch out for, which I'm concerned about. But as things escalate, is China potentially also making that move to make a unilateral declaration of an air defense identification zone in the South China Sea, similar to what it did in East China Sea with the dispute with Japan. I think that would really up the stakes if they were to do that.
One last question. Of course, we all want things to be resolved peacefully, no conflict, no nothing. Do you think it's entirely possible to have a purely diplomatic solution come out of this?
Well, I mean, obviously that's the hope as well, but I think it's going to be, in the end, I feel like that's the only realistic option. But I think there's going to be a whole array of pressure from both sides, from both the Chinese side and the American side, to try to get to that diplomatic solution. So I think that while both sides, there's a bit of bluster, there's a bit of talk, and there's also, the use of military assets and the threat of use of military assets, I think, to try to sway a final resolution. I still believe that the final solution, which both sides are going to, obviously, is diplomatic. But I think the United States is now perhaps reassessing or recalculating that it needs to use more of its push militarily and the threat of that push to try to sway China away from some of this more assertive action on the land reclamation and more aggressively pushing its claims. I mean, as President Obama mentioned recently, the United States just cannot stand by and let China flex its muscles and bully people around in the region. And I think that's kind of what a lot of this release of the video and the kind of more Secretary Kerry in China relaying that message to Beijing. I think these are more kind of this has been happening for a while. These overflights have been happening for a while, but making it public is just a sign by the United States that it has to kind of step it up a little bit.
All right. Jonathan Miller with the EastWest Institute, thank you so much for joining us once again.
Thanks a lot, Steve.
I would love to hear from you. Is 2015 the year shots will be fired in the South China Sea, or will cooler heads prevail? Be sure to chime in and let me know. Asia Now is a featured excerpt from the Asia News Weekly podcast, which is released every Friday. If you enjoyed the podcast, please share it with your friends, and if you haven't, subscribe. Subscribing is free, and when you do, the next episode is delivered automatically to you. You can subscribe on our website, asianewsweekly.net, or in your favorite podcast application. You'll be able to keep up with more news from the region by following Asia News Weekly on Facebook or Twitter. And if you have any comments, questions, or feedback, be sure to drop us a line. The email address is podcast@asianewsweekly.net. Thank you so much for joining us today. Until next time, remember to be true to yourself and to always be awesome.